So let me move on to the next. I want to sort of, in a way, sort of zoom out a little bit and speak sort of beyond the DOJ and talk sort of more broadly about our system of justice right now. How broken is it? How much do you attribute that to the highly partisan, extremist role of the Supreme Court? And can a lot of our troubles be attributed to their immunity ruling in July 1st of 2024 and the desire to hand Trump maximum power?
Yeah, that was also one of the most egregious Supreme Court opinions that has been handed down in my lifetime. And I don't want to compare it to, Dred Scott or Plessy versus Ferguson or Korematsu, but it was, just sort of horrible in a completely different way, because it was a ruling that, and let me just quote one of the preeminent constitutional scholars who is far smarter and more learned than me, Akil Reed Amar, Professor Akil Reed Amar, who said in the presidential immunity ruling, which is aptly named Trump versus the United States of America, because that's what we have been living.
That's
Trump
indeed what we've been dealing with for years.
He said in that legal opinion, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution itself is unconstitutional. And of course, they can't do that, but they did, because presidential immunity is contradicted expressly in at least two places in the Constitution, including the take care clause, that a president must take care to faithfully execute the laws of the country, not violate them with immunity from being held accountable for them. So, I mean, that has done untold damage. What was your original question before?
Well, I was really asking about the judicial system. How broken is it, and how much do you attribute it to the decision making, the sort of the reckless overtaking of the Constitution by the Supreme Court?
So another point of light, as I see it, is that the federal bench, by and large, has remained strong. It's the only branch of government that seems to be taking its check and balance responsibilities seriously. And the trial court judges in particular, from coast to coast, appointed by presidents as far back as Jimmy Carter, many Trump-appointed federal judges have been consistently ruling against Donald Trump day in and day out. That gives me confidence and a bit of a comfort level. The circuit courts of appeals have also held strong for the most part. So I feel like the federal bench has been up to the task of dealing with an aspiring dictator.
Right.
But you get up to the Supreme Court and all bets are off. Now, I was heartened on the birthright citizenship case, even though it was a bit of a squeaker, 6-3, yes, but Kavanaugh really wants to change sides and tried to give the executive branch a roadmap for how they can maybe go about changing.
A squeaker that should have been, 9-0, right?
Should have been 9-0. I also, when they overruled the Humphreys executor case, which said for, more than 100 years, I guess, the legislative branch can put some common sense legislation on the executive branch that serves as a check on potential executive branch abuse. And what the Supreme Court did, and the scholars say Chief Justice Roberts has been wanting to do this for a very long time, they killed Congress's ability to effectively serve as a check and balance against executive branch abuse. So what Roberts did is give Donald Trump a green light to basically become the all-powerful Article 2 ruler that Donald Trump has announced he wants to be. In fact, he announced that he is. He said Article 2 means I can do anything I want. And Chief Justice Roberts said, "You're right, Mr. President, I agree with you." That is going to be extraordinarily damaging because now Donald Trump can basically completely clean out the executive branch of honest public servants, and there is nothing constraining him. So, yes, the Supreme Court, I think all of this, Stephen, counsels in favor of us having to take seriously Supreme Court reform. It can be done. It has to be done.
So in fact, you've set up the fifth question. What reforms do you think are necessary for the Supreme Court? I mean, let's be specific.
Oh, specific. How about an enforceable code of ethics with investigative power if there is adequate evidence that they may have violated an ethical canon, and with an enforcement mechanism and consequences that come with violating the ethics that we expect of a Supreme Court justice, like complying with simple financial disclosure laws. I, every year, had to file financial disclosure forms as a Fed. They were the bane of my existence. We all hated doing them, but I'll be damned if I wasn't so careful. I didn't want to put one decimal in the wrong place and suggest that something involved 10 cents instead of $1. I was scared to death. I was going to accidentally make a mistake on my financial disclosure forms. And yet, Justice Thomas uses as an excuse for not disclosing anything that he obviously was required to disclose, like $250,000 mobile homes that were given to him, or his mom's house being renovated, or his de facto son being put through college at billionaire expense. What did he say? Some of my colleagues told me I didn't have to. That doesn't ordinarily fly when you violate financial disclosure laws. So, we have to, so I do want to get specific,
yeah,
but we have to deal with what I call the ruling class criminals, the way we deal with some poor kid who snatches a purse or sells a rock of crack cocaine. We investigate the crime and we seek accountability. But when it comes to the rich, the privileged, the influential, and the connected, whether they're Supreme Court justice, elected officials, big pharma, big tech, titans of industry, big Hollywood, big banking, military industrial complex. You know what we do when we catch those folks committing crime? We give them a non-prosecution agreement. I've seen it over and over again. That's the opposite of accountability and responsible governing. You hold them accountable for their crimes, and we have never had an appetite to do that. We need to start doing it, including with the Supreme Court. So what we do is we just open investigations, first congressional investigations, until the rule of law comes back into the light of day, to look into these financial disclosure violations by the Alitos and the Thomases. And we use DOJ to criminally investigate Supreme Court justices who may have committed crimes, including lying in their Senate confirmation hearings, in their zeal to become confirmed and be able to do the exact opposite of what they told us they would do. And then the other thing is we have to work to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. I know that's a controversial issue, but as you well know, we have had as few as 5 Supreme Court justices in our nation's history. We've had as many as 10. 9 is not a magic number. 9 is not a constitutionally required number.
What's the magic number?
There is, I say 13, because, and it's not a magic number, but we have increased the number of federal trial court judges to norm for the increased population and the increased caseload. We have increased the number of judges on the courts of appeals to norm for the increase in the caseload. We have 13 federal jurisdictions. One Supreme Court justice is supposed to have some sort of loosely defined supervisory responsibility over each of those 13 jurisdictions, and yet some have to double up because we've not increased the number of Supreme Court justices to norm for the increased population and caseload. We should do that at least for that reason, and hopefully to address what I see as at least a handful of ideologues on the Supreme Court who are willing to depart from the express text of the Constitution to bestow more power on what is presently a corrupt president after they spent their whole careers trying to convince us, dupe us into believing they were textualists.
Yeah, and it's, by the way, it's worth noting that laws and rules are created to regulate behavior, and that should apply to a Supreme Court justice, just as it and the rich, just as it applies to everybody else.